Welcome everybody to the ITUC's global webinar on corporate power and the fight for democracy in global institutions. To start the call, I'm going to hand it over to the ITUC's Deputy General Secretary, Jordania Urena, who will introduce us to the call. Please remember to use interpretation buttons, which you can find at the bottom of your screen if you're using Zoom on a laptop. Find interpretation and select your language of choice. Jordania, the floor is yours.
Muchísimas gracias, Todd. Bueno, buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches, compañeros y compañeras. Como decía Todd, soy Jordania Ureña, secretaria general adjunta de nuestra Confederación Sindical Internacional, la CCI. Primero agradecerles el acompañarnos en esta convocatoria, al estar aquí en el día de hoy para poder hablar un poco del poder corporativo y de la lucha por la democracia en las instituciones globales. Este es ya el tercero de una serie de seminarios que hemos organizado desde la CCI en el marco de esa campaña que ustedes han estado viendo que hemos llevado a cabo o que estamos llevando a cabo por la democracia. Y es que mientras 4.000 millones de personas votan para elegir nuevos gobiernos este año, nosotros y nosotras estamos haciendo campaña por la democracia, pero con un concepto mucho más amplio del de ir a votar cada 4 años. Estamos colocando el concepto de democracia mucho más allá de elegir a una persona para que dirija los destinos de su país. Hablamos de una democracia en el trabajo, en las sociedades, en las instituciones mundiales, en todos los espacios. De esa democracia es que estamos hablando en el marco de nuestra campaña. Y es que desde Guatemala hasta Indonesia, decenas de millones de trabajadores se han movilizado para cambiar las políticas ante estas elecciones que se van a dar. Han hecho un trabajo arduo porque necesitamos cambiar un poco las reglas del juego e identificar a dónde se están faltando, a dónde se está afectando la democracia en estos espacios que hemos dicho, para que estas políticas se vean antes de hacer esta elección de quienes van a coordinar los destinos de estos países. Pero también desde Uganda hasta Colombia se han organizado para crear democracia en sus lugares de trabajo y han emprendido huelgas, han hecho diferentes actividades militantes en sus lugares de trabajo. En todo el mundo se lucha por una visión de democracia en la que los trabajadores y las trabajadoras marquemos juntos y juntas el rumbo de nuestras comunidades, pero también de nuestros lugares de trabajo, de nuestros países y de nuestras instituciones internacionales. En el día de hoy nos vamos a centrar en la democracia a escala mundial en 3 paneles de expertos. Nuestro primer panel va a analizar de una forma interesantísima y al más alto nivel las instituciones globales, donde las delegaciones gubernamentales negocian esas normas y esos tratados con esos objetivos claves que dan la forma al mundo del trabajo y a toda la vida humana. Así que vamos a escuchar por qué es tan importante para nosotros y nosotras en el movimiento sindical, para los sindicatos en los territorios, para los trabajadores y las trabajadoras, defender nuestros intereses en los diferentes espacios como la ONU, como las diferentes instituciones financieras internacionales y también, obviamente, en la OIT. Por otro lado, vamos a revelar, que esto me parece interesantísimo, nuestra primera lista de empresas que socavan la democracia. Estas empresas utilizan grupos de presión mundiales para hacer ese efecto, ¿no?, de afectar y golpear la democracia, las decisiones del pueblo, financian movimientos de extrema derecha que cuando están en el poder atacan las instituciones multilaterales y también intentan debilitar la regulación y avanzan, ¿no? Y se ve muy marcado el poder empresarial. En nuestro segundo panel vamos a escuchar a las federaciones sindicales mundiales y a los aliados sociales hablar de cómo estas empresas se están beneficiando, violando nuestros derechos, cómo están monopolizando los medios de comunicación, que es algo que vemos constantemente, la tecnología y cómo impulsan el cambio climático y privatizan los servicios públicos. Y por último, nuestro tercer panel va a debatir lo que los sindicatos estamos haciendo al respecto. ¿Cuáles son las formas en las que estamos luchando para reformar estas instituciones globales? ¿Cuál es la política que estamos defendiendo? ¿Qué está haciendo el movimiento sindical ante este escenario tan complejo, tan complicado, donde se está viendo afectada la democracia? Y vamos a estar escuchando qué hacer, qué se hace o qué pretendemos proponer desde el movimiento sindical en torno a la política global para que se pueda frenar este poder corporativo y seguir un nuevo contrato social que, como hemos estado hablando desde nuestro Congreso, pues es lo que perseguimos y lo que queremos que todos los trabajadores y las trabajadoras pues podamos lograr nuevamente. Al final tendremos tiempo, obviamente, para preguntas de todos y todas los que están participando, a nuestros panelistas, y bueno, decir que gracias de nuevo por acompañarnos, de verdad, muchísimas gracias porque esto también forma parte importante en el marco de esta campaña y de los esfuerzos que estamos haciendo desde la CCI en favor de la democracia. Así que paso la palabra a nuestro director de comunicaciones, el compañero Philip, para que por favor presente nuestro primer panel. Muchísimas gracias a todos y todas.
Gracias, Jordania. Thank you, Jordania. I will speak in English. So unions have always been leading the fight to advance workers' rights on the global stage. And their role within international institutions is really central to protect and expand these gains. Unfortunately, with corporate influence growing more and more, the trade union presence and advocacy within these institutions is more important than ever. And so this first panel will focus on these really crucial questions. How do unions use international institutions to build workers' power? So through this panel, we'll explore how unions are actively setting standards, how they are expanding fundamental rights, how they are steering government towards policies that are protecting workers. So our first panelist, Maite Llanos, director of the ITC Geneva office, will discuss how unions are influencing the setting of standards and definitions at the ILO, whether it's in relation, for example, to platform work or living wages. So Maite, up to you.
Voy a hablar en español. Hola compañeros y compañeras, es un gusto poder estar acá con ustedes. Entonces voy a buscar responder muy brevemente a las preguntas que nos pusieron para esta actividad. Lo primero decir que la OIT fue creada por los trabajadores, entonces lo que estamos haciendo nosotros es defender un legado de nuestros compañeros y compañeras que estuvieron al inicio de esta organización hace más de 100 años y nuestra tarea es hacer que la OIT siga respondiendo a los intereses de los trabajadores y las trabajadoras, que parecería algo que está por dado, pero no siempre es así. Entonces, nuestro trabajo principal es seguir haciendo una OIT que responda a nuestras necesidades y que proteja a los trabajadores y trabajadoras. Y si hablamos de poder corporativo, creo que, como bien decía el compañero, una de las últimas batallas que tuvimos se trata de poner en la agenda un estándar, una norma internacional de trabajo para controlar el poder corporativo de las empresas de plataformas en la forma de un convenio que proteja a los trabajadores de estas empresas. Hoy por hoy, la mayoría de los trabajadores del sector no tienen ninguna capacidad de organizarse porque la libertad sindical y la negociación colectiva, los dos principios que permiten la organización de los trabajadores, no les son garantizados, además de violaciones en relación a salarios, tiempo de trabajo y demás. Entonces, esa fue una batalla que estuvimos dando en los últimos años. Plamen está presente acá, con el cual tuve la suerte de compartir estas aventuras, digamos, de traer un tema tan difícil a la OIT. Conseguimos que esté en la agenda, vamos a negociar el año que viene, en el 2025 y en el 2026, una norma internacional de trabajo sobre la economía de plataformas. Esperemos que sea un convenio y puedo decir que batimos todos los récords en respuestas a la OIT, lo que muestra un enorme interés de los sindicatos por tener una regulación en este sentido. Y tener una regulación significa poder organizar y a la vez tener un sector organizado nos permite tener más fuerza en la OIT. Así que la OIT y la organización de los trabajadores no están desvinculadas, sino todo lo contrario. Lo mismo con los salarios vitales. Estaba en la constitución de la OIT, pero por muchísimos años estuvo bloqueado. Pudimos tener a inicios de este año, también con Plamen como portavoz en ese caso, un acuerdo sobre cuáles serían la metodología para poder, o las orientaciones metodológicas para poder tener salarios vitales, es decir, ponerle carne a esta definición y darle a los compañeros y compañeras a nivel nacional y a lo largo de las cadenas de suministro unas herramientas y la intervención de la OIT, el apoyo técnico de la OIT para poder negociar salarios que les permitan vivir y que les permitan trabajar las horas que quienes fundaron la OIT pusieron en el convenio número 1, 8 horas de trabajo, 8 horas de descanso, 8 horas de ocio. Entonces, la idea es poder tener salarios que nos permitan vivir y no vivir para trabajar. Creo que estos fueron los últimos elementos, pero también no olvidemos que cuando negociamos un convenio sobre riesgos biológicos, también estamos defendiendo a los trabajadores y también estamos discutiendo con las empresas y quiénes son responsables por la salud de los trabajadores. Soy muy breve, creo que esta era la idea inicial. Me quedo acá una media hora también, porque tengo que volver a otra reunión en el sector de los materiales de construcción, donde también hay muchas empresas multinacionales que abusan de su poder y pagan salarios miserables. Gracias.
Thank you, Maite. So the importance of setting clear standards cannot be understated, I think, especially when we see corporations attempting to dilute them in these global institutions. So our next panelist, Susanna Muscat-Gorska from our legal unit, will now discuss the work to expand and protect these fundamental rights that have been gained, and more specifically on occupation health and safety and defending and protecting the right to strike.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. I will cover three issues, three campaigns, mainly legal campaigns, defending the right to strike in the International Court of Justice using United Nations mechanisms for enforcement of labor rights, and our work on the UN Business and Human Rights new treaty that covers access to justice. So first, on the right to strike in the International Court of Justice, we know that we are blocked in the International Labour Organization since 2012 because the employers' groups refused to recognize that the right to strike is protected under ILO Convention 87. In other words, they question that the existence of the right to strike in the international law. The organization is blocked since then on this issue. So we finally decided to file the case in the International Court of Justice for interpretation. And we deal with a big problem because we know that according to the ITUC index, in 2024, 87 countries violated the right to strike. So this case is very important, not only for workplace democracy, but also for democracy as a whole. The right to strike is the corollary of exercising also political rights. Oral arguments are expected in the coming months, and we expect the opinion in 2025, and we hope that the court will side with us and will confirm the existence of the right to strike in international law. But as the organization, the ILO, is a bit blocked on the issue, workers are trying to find additional legal venues for legal advocacy. And since the last 4 years, we intensified trade union presence in the reviews of the UN member states under 2 human rights treaties, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So ITUC is supporting trade unions to submit shadow reports and to take part in the reviews. And we currently see a growing number of observations made by supervisory bodies of these treaties that make specific comments on trade union rights and also on human rights of workers on precarious contracts. So, for instance, last year on South Korea, the Committee on Civil and Political Rights specifically pronounced itself on the on the right to organize, bargain, and strike of all workers, including workers on non-standard forms of employment. And this year, in the review of Indonesia, we had a specific observation that unregulated use of temporary contracts, or for instance, platform work contracts, and the lack of job security can violate human rights. And the last thing is the legal gaps that we have at the international level, where we cannot have the corporations accountable for the workers' rights abuses in the supply chains. And we have the process at the level of the United Nations since 2014 that aims at adopting a binding treaty regulating conduct of transnational companies as regards to human rights and regulating access to justice. And trade unions, together with hundreds of civil society organizations, back this process, and we are trying to achieve as strong instrument as possible. The current updated draft was published last year in July in 2023, and the next session, the negotiation session, will happen in December this year. So that's these are just 3 examples. Legal initiatives, of course, are not sufficient, but we also need progressive international law and strong remedies for trade unions so that we can curb the corporate negative influence on the world of work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanna. An index every year, indeed, the Global Rights Index every year shows that these fundamental rights are increasingly under threat year after year. So expanding and safeguarding them is really crucial for unions. Finally, our last panelist, Evelyn Astor, Director of the ITUC Economic and Social Policy Department, will address our unions or driving governments toward policies that support workers, including on social protection, development, just transition, and many others.
Thanks very much, Philippe, and hi to everyone. So my colleagues already explained the importance of some key international frameworks and standards that can help drive national reform processes, and specifically the role of the ILO. So I won't comment further on that. But I would like to focus on some other international policy coordination processes, such as UN development processes, the UNFCCC climate agenda, and the G20, where governments are making commitments at international level in areas that are favorable to workers, and where such commitments can actually be helpful for backing in unions in their national level work. Let me start with the UN SDGs. Because when they were adopted in 2015, this was really a milestone. This represented a comprehensive joint agenda by governments to promote sustainable development, including commitments around the reduction of poverty, the extension of social protection systems, promoting extensions to education and other essential services, reducing inequalities, and of course, there was a specific goal 8, which was around decent work, which unions were very happy to see, but of course wanted to see actually implemented in practice. What I can say is that unions have been very active in lobbying their government, and also been very active at the international level in terms of promoting the implementation and financing of the SDGs since they've been set. In that regard, I'd want to specifically acknowledge the work of the Trade Union Development Cooperation Network for what they've done there. And what we're seeing is, following very consistent, concerted, coordinated advocacy from unions within UN processes, is that the SDG implementation process is continuing to reflect key union demands. Last year at the SDG Summit Declaration, there was a specific call by governments for reforming international financial architecture to make it more democratic, to give countries the necessary fiscal space they actually need to make worker-friendly investments. And also as a direct outcome of union advocacy around SDGs, and specifically as an outcome of unions' calls for greater international support for social protection and jobs, the UN 2 years ago started their Global Accelerator Initiative on Jobs and Social Protection. So this is an initiative that is reorienting UN technical support within some specific countries to actually allow for national convening of social partners and governments to discuss how to extend social protection and jobs and identify how the UN can provide the necessary technical support there. Within the G20, as many of you may know, there is a process of bringing together trade unions within G20 countries. It's called the L20. This is a process where we have a summit that takes place every year amongst trade union leaders right before the G20 labor and employment ministers meetings. And within the advocacy there, we've managed to secure a number of commitments from G20 labor ministers, as well as G20 leaders. And just to name a few, first of all, in 2021, G20 leaders actually agreed on a minimum corporate tax. The level is less than what unions have been calling for. We've called for 25%. G20 leaders agreed for 15%. But nevertheless, this was a major milestone in terms of addressing downward competition between countries on the basis of tax. This downward competition is hollowing out public budgets. And this is a commitment by G20 leaders that also brought forward broader global processes around tax coordination, with then the OECD BEPS process being developed, so an OECD tax coordination process. And now, in fact, the UN has recently adopted in terms of reference, launching a process around the UN Convention on Tax. And I'm sure that Danny Bertosa will say much more about this, so I won't go more in detail, but this is an example of how work within the G20 has managed to actually push forward a broad agenda around tax coordination. And beyond tax, we've also seen the G20 labor and employment ministers actually putting forward joint commitments in other areas of great priority for workers, including around reducing inequalities, increasing the labor income share, as well as strengthening social protection. We've seen the G20 labor and employment minister statement of this year specifically committing to those. Finally, let me say something about unions' influence within the international climate agenda. Within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, what's called the UNFCCC, trade unions have managed to get international commitments towards just transition for workers as part of their broader global commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and combat climate change. This is because we know that the climate crisis is already having a major impact on workers' jobs, workers' livelihoods, and that the transition also towards a zero carbon economy will have implications in terms of workers' jobs. And so workers need a seat at the table. They need to be involved in the planning around how these processes will be brought forward, how workers' jobs will be secured, how new jobs being created in the green economy will be quality jobs, how social protection will be provided for workers that may be negatively affected either through climate change or through climate mitigation. And at COP28, the Just Transition Work Plan was adopted, a major milestone for the global labor movement. And for the first time in history, the UNFCCC referred to the importance of labor rights. But this brings me to the last point that I want to close with, which is that our work does not stop at getting agreement of nice language or commitments at international level, because if we don't make sure that governments back home are held accountable for what they've agreed internationally, then there's no point in investing in being in these spaces. So what it means is that we need to be really strong on communicating what's happening between the international and the national levels. We need to make sure that unions can actually make use of government commitments at the global level to drive their national advocacy work. If G20 members are saying we are going to increase wages and strengthen social protection, then unions in those G20 countries can hold their governments accountable to that back home. And if they start to implement austerity, then they should be reminded of what they've said in Fortaleza, Brazil, for example. As for the UNFCCC, so we have a just transition work program, but now what we also need to see is progress by governments on just transition within their nationally determined contributions. So that is something that certainly we are trying to promote now going into the next COP29 in Azerbaijan, and something that we will bring together jointly. So I'll stop here, and I'm sure that many of the other speakers will bring up, I think, in more detail some of the points that I've made already. Thanks.
Thank you. So thank you, Maite, Suzanne, and Evelyn, for your brief but up to the point contribution. I think it's clear that unions are still the major force for shaping global standards and protecting the rights of workers. And the role in international institutions, their role really ensures that these interests of workers are represented, but also that governments are held accountable for the policies that affect workers. And it's very important now because we see relentless attacks on the interests of workers by corporate power, which is the next discussion, and which is the discussion you will explore now. Up to you, Todd. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philippe. Thank you, Susanna and Maite and Evelyn. What we've done here is try to set the context for why unions are involved in these global institutions to begin with. And now what we're going to talk about is we're going to shift a little bit to talk about, we've referenced corporate power many times, but corporate power has names and it has addresses. And so we're going to shift to a discussion now with several of our colleagues from global union federations and social movement allies. And in a second, I'll introduce Natalie Swan from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. But before I do, the center of this call is built around what ITUC has announced today for the first time ever, which is a list of corporate underminers of democracy. And you can find this list on the front page of our website at ituc-csi.org. I'm also going to place the link in the chat right now. This list is the first time we've created something like this. And the reason was because as we talk about global institutions, oftentimes we are focused on the lobbying and the advocacy of governments, which is really important. But at the same time we are talking to them, they are being pressured with immense pressure and immense financial resources by multinational corporations that have, frankly, the opposite agenda of us. They are not democratically elected by anybody. Their agenda is about flexibilization, about precarity, about undermining regulation and rights. And so the ITUC began a process speaking to a lot of different partners, researchers, global union federations, our own affiliates, to try to identify the beginning of a project. And we'll be working more with Progressive International and their associate, the Autonomy Institute, to try to develop this into a more regular analysis of corporate power. But this year we focused on 7 companies that again and again came up. And those 7, as you will find in the link in the chat, are Amazon, the Blackstone Group, ExxonMobil, Glencore, Meta, which is the parent company of Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, etc., Tesla, and the Vanguard Group. Some of these are household names. You all probably know or have heard or read about who they are. Others may not be so familiar to you. You can find profiles on each on the link that I've just shared. But for our discussion today, what we've decided to do is focus on a few of them. And rather than hear why we've selected them, we want to hear from people and organizations who are directly engaging with them, and those who are also researching and looking at sort of how these companies connect back to the far right movements and how they use those far right movements to further deregulate and undermine democracy. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the moderator of our next panel, Natalie Swan, who comes from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. The floor is yours, Natalie. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Todd. As Todd said, my name is Natalie Swan, and I'm the Program Manager for Labour Rights and Supply Chains at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Before I introduce our panel, I'll give a bit more information about the Resource Center. So we have staff and researchers in over 30 countries around the world, monitoring cases and allegations of corporate abuse. So we work with rights holders and very often workers and their trade unions to seek public company responses to allegations of abuse, to get information on how they're remedying allegations of abuse, and really importantly, to look at how we can systemically change business practices across multiple sectors. So alongside our independent research and advocacy, you might be aware of our website, which was described to me recently by one of the rights holders that we were working with as a Google for human rights. So you can find over 25,000 pages of information on companies linked to human rights abuses, and really importantly, 10,000 company pages, including each of the 7 corporate underminers we'll be looking at today. And on those company pages, you can see allegations of human rights abuse and labor rights abuse that these companies have been linked to, alongside key indicators of good or bad practice in relation to human rights. So we've been working with the ITUC over the course of this campaign to look at these 7 companies. And as Todd said, we want to drill down a little bit more now into the detail of how these companies are not just undermining human rights, but are complicit with the far right. And then what are global institutions doing about this, for better or worse? I'd like to introduce our panel. So first up, we have Walton Pantland. Walton is the Director for Campaigns and Organising and Shipbuilding and Shipbreaking for Industrial Global Union. It's a global union federation based in Geneva, Switzerland, representing 55 million workers in 160 countries in the mining, manufacturing and energy sectors. Walton was born in South Africa and previously worked for unions in South Africa and the UK. Nicholas Rudikoff is Campaigns Director at Uni Global Union. He leads the organization's work on Amazon and is co-convener of Make Amazon Pay, which includes the ITUC and 80 other organizations fighting to hold Amazon accountable for its impact to workers, communities, and our planet. Finally, we have David Adler, who is a political economist and general coordinator of the Progressive International. Previously, he was an advisor on the foreign policy team of Senator Bernie Sanders and the policy director for Yanis Varoufakis and the Democracy in Europe movement. So that's our panel. And I'd like to invite Walton, first and foremost, to talk to us about 3 of our companies today. So how do ExxonMobil, Glencore, and Tesla undermine democracy, Walton?
Thank you, Natalie. And working for industrial and confronting companies like this every day, I think we could draw up a very long list of corporations that undermine democracy, but let's focus on these 3. And starting with ExxonMobil, I think it would be their funding of climate denialism. So climate change, I think, is the existential crisis that we face as the world, as a society, as Evelyn was speaking about earlier. The UN FCCC is trying to coordinate efforts to deal with climate change, and ExxonMobil has spent millions and millions of dollars funding climate denialism, funding lobby groups, funding politicians who are fighting against climate policies. And they also, of course, send a number of lobbyists to meetings like COP, often as part of various front groups. And Evelyn is correct that the unions have done a good job at COPs and have a good, well-disciplined delegation, but we don't have the resources that the climate lobbyists have. And it feels like this existential battle to save the future between groups like ourselves and community groups who are fighting for an agreement that will leave us with a livable planet, and these corporate underminers who are interested only in short-term profit and are funding denialism. The next one on the list is Glencore, which I think many people are probably familiar with because undermining democracy is the company's business model. The company was founded in the 1970s and made its money from sanctions busting. And in fact, the founder of the company was on the FBI's most wanted list for almost 20 years because of sanctions busting, which is why the company is currently headquartered in Switzerland. They moved to Switzerland to avoid the US authorities. So Glencore, and in fact, one of the main things that Glencore does to undermine democracy is that it's trying to control the entire commodity supply chain, which means that everything that we need for our just future, Glencore wants to control. So whether that's copper, cobalt, lithium, whatever it is, Glencore both controls a lot of the mining of that, but also the sales of it. And so whatever happens in the future is very much down to decisions made by this company and not by countries. And one of the consequences as well is that Glencore is a massive resource extractor, leaving behind very little benefit for the countries where it operates. And it's a classic example of what's called the resource curse, where a country has a really valuable resource that the world needs, and as a consequence of that, you get corruption and you get men with guns. And these are things which have come up time and again in countries where Glencore operates. Funding of paramilitary groups in countries like the Philippines, Colombia, Peru, paying off the security forces to suppress protest, firing trade union members, of course, that's quite common, spying on trade union leaders, and also really, really large-scale corruption, essentially bribing government officials for access to raw materials. Recently, there was a massive case of corruption in, I think, at least 8 countries, and eventually Glencore pled guilty and was fined $1.5 billion. So that was the fine. You can imagine the scale of corruption that they were involved in for that. And then in addition, it's suing governments like the government of Colombia through investor-state dispute mechanisms over decisions that that country is making about its future on coal. So in other words, rather than recognizing that the people of Colombia have the sovereign right to decide their economic future, they are being sued by Glencore successfully for loss of profit. And then the final one on the list is Tesla. I don't think anyone needs me to tell you about Elon Musk and his links to right-wing, don't know what to call them. I'm going to start saying bad language, so I'm not going to say any more about Elon Musk at this point. But let's just focus on Tesla. And why Tesla is important is because the auto industry currently is one of the best organized sectors in the global workforce. It tends to have very, very strong unions, but it's going through a major transformation at the moment as it pivots towards electronic vehicles. And Tesla is a world leader in electronic vehicles. So everything that happens at Tesla sets a precedent for what is likely to happen in the rest of the industry. And Tesla is completely against unions. Tesla union busts. Tesla has broken the law to union bust in the US, in Germany, in many other countries. And there is a global fight by unions at Tesla plants for recognition. There is a big battle underway at the moment in a factory called Grünheide, close to Berlin, where the union IG Metall is struggling to get a foothold. And this is a plant which very much needs a union because work pressure is really high. Ambulances are called out for industrial injuries. There are real issues that need to be addressed, and Tesla has been trying to sidestep German law to avoid having a union presence. But actually, for me, the worst example is a relatively minor case, which is Sweden, where a very small group of Tesla mechanics, I think it's around 30 people, have gone on strike because Tesla refuses to sign the collective agreement. And rather than sign the collective agreement, Tesla has flown in 30 strikebreakers from across Europe, which it smuggles into workshops to do the work that the striking workers are not doing. And why it's important is because Sweden doesn't really have a lot of labor laws like many other countries. Everything is co-determined by agreements between unions and employers' federations. And it's one of the most successful industrial relations models in the world. It results in very, very high level of social harmony and good conditions for workers, as well as successful companies. And in this case, Tesla is the thin end of the wedge, which is trying to split apart the Swedish system of co-determination. And yeah, I think the real danger with Tesla is that they will set a precedent for what happens in the auto sector and in manufacturing more generally.
Thanks so much, Walton. I think you were dealing with the issue there of not just one of the companies you're talking about being a household name, but their CEO as well. I'm going to flip from one global union federation to another and ask Nick to give us a bit more information on how Uni Global Union is engaging with Amazon, Meta, and Vanguard, and how you see these companies as undermining democracy.
Thanks so much, Natalie, and thanks to ITUC for the invitation. I'm going to talk a bit about Meta, Blackstone, and Amazon, actually. Meta is really quite extraordinary. I was just looking, they have about 8 billion users across their various properties. Obviously, Facebook and WhatsApp would be probably the best known of them. So Mark Zuckerberg, who founded the company, owns 13% of it, but somehow controls 61% of the votes, which I think is a good analogy for the conversation we're having today. How can one man have that much power? 8 billion users across those platforms. And Zuckerberg essentially gets to choose what we all see and what gets promoted. So the threat to democracy clearly comes down to the way Meta is able to inflame passions and spread disinformation with terrible results. Two key ones that we could point to are the genocide in Myanmar in 2017, where Meta rushed into the country without any safeguards, without any regulation, and the platform was able to be a conduit for the most genocidal impulses and misinformation that really had terrible consequences for human beings. And then in the United States, following the last presidential election, which President Biden won, Meta properties disseminated incredible conspiracy theories without being checked. And there were a lot of concern from employees, from workers, that the company wasn't doing enough to actually, put accurate information out there. So there you have a situation where workers were concerned. The company didn't listen because of profits. Blackstone is one of the largest private equity companies in the world. And for those who don't know, the model of private equity is quite simple. Private equity firms buy distressed companies using other people's money, generally 60% loans. They load the company up with debt, and then they start slashing and burning in order to drive profitability for a quick turnaround and sale. So what that means for workers is reductions in force, reductions in quality of care in the healthcare setting or anywhere else. And throughout this process, the private equity executives get to suck management fees out of the company. So they win no matter what. It's a win-win situation for them. It's a lose-lose situation for workers and the communities. Blackstone, I think, deserves special recognition as really the world's largest and cruelest landlord. Blackstone helped pioneer the business of buying single-family homes or multifamily apartments. And in 2019, where it was condemned by the UN Special Rapporteur on housing, saying that they were, quote, wreaking havoc in the communities and funding a global housing crisis. A lot of our energies at Uni are directed at Amazon. Amazon is the world's 5th largest company, probably the 3rd largest employer, a proper monopolist in that they are the largest e-commerce company, the largest cloud computing company, and the largest logistics company on earth. And they're deeply anti-union. They use their power in a number of different ways. Old-fashioned lobbying, they're the #1 largest lobbyist in the US. I'm sorry, #2 behind Meta in the United States, and the 7th largest in Europe. But also increasingly, they are the holders of all of our public data. They created cloud computing. They have 33% of the global cloud market, and their governments are increasingly turning to Amazon to host public data, which is to say, the British Tax Office, the Australian Motor Vehicle Bureau, etc., the US Central Intelligence Agency. So all of these things, the lobbying, the e-commerce, being powerful employers, all of it puts Amazon in a position to have leverage over governments. And that's to the benefit of Amazon's owner, Jeff Bezos, who's, generally the second or third richest person on earth. And it puts them in a very, very strong position to shape the future. That's, I think, why we need to fight back. That's why we are fighting back. And I'll talk about that in the next session. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I think both you and Walton really talked about the way that these companies are kind of extending beyond what you normally think a company does, which is selling goods and services, and almost kind of seeping into every aspect of our lives as individuals, collective citizens. And so I'm really interested to hear from David on how these companies are intersecting with and supporting the far right in particular. So what does this mean more generally for society, and how are these companies using their influence?
Thanks so much, Natalie, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone. My name is David Adler, and I'm the co-general coordinator of an organization called the Progressive International. We are a global network of trade unions, social movements, political parties around the world, constructing our own infrastructure to combat the other international, the reactionary international against which we are arrayed. And we're very lucky to count on the ITUC as partners, to have the chance to work with Danny at PSI, and of course, to be supporting from its birth the Make Amazon Pay work alongside Nick and all of our friends at Uni Global. So that's us at Progressive International. And our work on this issue of the corporate underminers of democracy, the questions that we've heard, terrific presentations, both in the first panel and the second one, is that we actually don't know as much as we need to know about this question. There are many known unknowns and even other unknown unknowns about the question of how corporations and their covert allies are undermining our democracies. And I think we need to make a critical distinction here between those overt tactics, the things that we've been thinking about and working on and struggling against for a century of trade union organization and defense of democratic rights, and these more covert tactics, many of which are incredibly novel. And when I say novel, I'm not just talking about 30 years necessarily, but even 5 years. We'll get into this in a bit. But they're also deeply insidious, and therefore require, I think, a renewed attention to and investment in research tactics that can expose, unveil, and ultimately dismantle some of this reactionary architecture or infrastructure that is sustaining the advance of the far right around the world. A lot of us focus on the big names of the far right, the Javier Mileis, the Jair Bolsonaros, even the Hungary's Viktor Orban and the CPAC organizations there, and the big corporations as well, who are leading this charge, as Nick was setting up before, or these Blackstones. But there's a broader infrastructure that I think is worth us taking into account. So I wanted to give in this first round of interventions just a few examples of these sort of known unknowns, and why I think we are being called here not just to build a kind of mobilizing force, but also to think about investigation and research as being a really critical aspect of this struggle. So the first is around disinformation. Nick would have spoken about how these platforms lead huge or provide a space and oxygen for a lot of these kind of conspiracy theories and genocidal rhetoric, and ultimately WhatsApp becomes a weapon in the hands of people who want to do a lot of social, ecological, environmental, political harm. But we don't know that much yet, not just about the platforms, but about where that disinformation originates. I think we begin from a premise that this is a highly structured form of disinformation, much more than it is a totally disaggregated one, or one that comes out of nowhere. And there's some really good preliminary research that we're doing through our consortium and its various partners to shed light on that international infrastructure of disinformation and the ways in which, when a hashtag emerges and explodes onto the scene, whether it's in Mexico or it's in Argentina, oftentimes it's coming from very specific places, designed by very specific firms that specialize in that kind of diffusion of disinformation. It's a very profitable industry, and increasingly so, to become advanced and analytical about how to move disinformation across these platforms. So therefore, not just taking, the Zuckerbergs to account, but also looking underneath the hood to see who are the main partners of these platforms that are diffusing disinformation. Another one is about financing. Part of the financing picture, we know, and certainly these corporations have more money than God to be able to move ahead with their agendas of exclusion and hatred and worker repression. But we also know that the financial world we live in is so opaque that every once in a while we wait for the Pandora Papers or the Panama Papers, but we have to accept and start from the premise that we actually do not know very much about the arteries of illicit finance that are allowing corporate influence to go really deep into our political systems. It's obviously the case that Mark Zuckerberg doesn't want to show up and necessarily give a big old hug to Jair Bolsonaro. We know that there are many financial intermediaries that are moving between these people, whether it's campaign donations or, private contracting and procurement. But we need to do a much better job at finding out not just the questions of corporate capture, but really these questions of illicit finance that are running through the global economy, pocketing in places like the Cayman Islands and elsewhere, to uncover an infrastructure that sustains this corporate kind of far-right connection. A third issue is technology. This is something that we think a lot about, the Elon Musks and the ways in which innovation, again, has been captured and deployed against worker power across the world. But we also know that there are specialists, special firms across the world that are developing and diffusing repressive technologies like Pegasus. And I think it's our responsibility to take very seriously the threat that those technologies present, to understand, even on technology as intimate as our cell phones, who's reading, who's watching, and what are the firms that are diffusing that kind of technology across the world. These are things we don't really know the answers to, but we need to take seriously for the health and safety of our allies, of workers and trade unions, but also for the robustness of our democratic systems and democratic freedoms more broadly. And finally, we have the issue of ideas. Ideas, if we take seriously the intellectual linkage between these, and certainly Elon Musk is like a critical example of how these diffusion of so-called memes becomes an critical vector of kind of democratic illness in our societies. And many people have focused on some of the bigger actors who are diffusing some of these dangerous kind of far ideas. The Atlas Network, for example, is one that gets a lot of attention. But I think we need to focus on another set of actors, another set of questions about how these ideas spread across the world. To give you an example, Accenture is a global consulting firm that does hundreds of millions of dollars of public contracting with our governments on top of its corporate contracting, and is responsible for developing large-scale surveillance and migrant crackdown technologies that are basically these frontline carceral technologies to get deployed first against vulnerable and marginal populations, but also against, democratic civilizations, right? And those are being led by frontline actors that are not the commonly considered ones of the great corporate, the good and the great of the corporate world necessarily, but are their allies that work in concert and in coordination in this generalized and secular crackdown on democratic freedoms. So why is this important? Well, first of all, it's important because it's all this information is not well known by our allies, by our policymakers, by our political systems. We need to do a much better job of unearthing this information to get a better picture, a clear picture of the networks, of the actors, of the entities, of the activities of Reactionary International, but also because a lot of this stuff is illegal. And we're leaving a lot on the table for our policymakers. If we can do a better job of unearthing, of exposing, of revealing this slew of illegal activities, we can do a much better job of arming our policymakers to go after these actors, to crack down on that illicit finance, to strip away those illegal technologies, and to regain a lot of the critical democratic freedoms that have really slowly and under this sort of shadow of in the darkness been eroded over time. So I think that's I think the critical premise we start from. We know that we don't know a lot, and a call to action, I think, for everyone on the call to say, how can we do a better job as the ITUC is leading now on thinking about the connections between large corporate actors, their allies in the shadows, and the policymakers that are leading this reactionary wave around the world at its front lines. Thanks, Natalie.
Thanks, David. And even with all of those unknowables, you outline a very complex, multi-layered problem. And as we shift to the second part of this panel, we're going to talk about solutions. We're going to talk about workers and their trade unions and what levers can they pull to drive accountability, to shift change from the workplace to the country level to the international. We are running a little bit behind time, so I will ask panelists to keep to 2 minutes in their response, if possible, 3. But Walton, what's Industrial doing to tackle these problems and specifically engage with those companies that kind of fall under your remit?
Thanks, Natalie. I think that I would say our approach is threefold. And the first one is to get organized. The second is to build coalitions. And the third is to do investor and public relations work. So, and we take a similar approach with all companies, but Glencore, for example, we have very good unions in Glencore sites in Australia, Canada, Peru, Colombia, the DRC, South Africa. And we bring them together often to talk about issues at Glencore and to coordinate activity. And that's been really useful at understanding the company, doing the research, building our narrative, deciding what we want from the company. And then the other thing that we've done is over the years, build up a really big coalition of civil society and community groups who are also affected by Glencore. And for example, earlier this year, we participated in the Glencore AGM, which is something we do quite often. But this time we were there with a really, really big civil society coalition. And it was quite remarkable, actually. Inside the AGM, I think about 20 minutes was devoted to the report of the company, and the next hour and more was just interventions from community groups. And in the case of Glencore, I believe that this is beginning to have a disciplining effect on the company, combined with things like the massive fines that they've received, the negative attention, and the fact that so many institutional investors have already blacklisted the company. It's no longer as profitable as it was to sanctions bust and ignore laws. And I think that there's a slow movement towards discipline and slightly more compliance with the law in Glencore as a consequence. And in Tesla as well, I think that what's happening there is actually old-fashioned stuff, trade union solidarity. It's a small labor dispute in Sweden, but across the region, not just in Sweden, but Denmark and Norway, unions have shown solidarity. They're refusing to load parts for Tesla. They're refusing to do administrative work. At one point, the post office workers were refusing to deliver post. And over the summer, there have been solidarity delegations from other auto workers visiting. So that dispute is being kept live through labor solidarity. And I think that at the German site, I think that IG Metall is going to organize a majority of workers and get a collective agreement, the old-fashioned way. Go in there, talk to workers. Recently at the Works Council election, they got a substantial number of seats, not yet a majority, but they definitely have a solid presence in that factory. They have a very good organizing campaign, and I think they will organize that Tesla plant. And I think that is going to set the precedent for workers' rights in Tesla.
Thanks, Walton, and best of luck and solidarity to those workers trying to build that campaign. Nick, when it comes to Uni Global, what are you doing? How can we make a shift?
Yeah, so I mean, I think with, for unions, for all unions, our power comes from the power of workers on the shop floor. And so when we talk about, how do we fight back in this economy, whether it's about at Amazon, Blackstone, Meta, or anything, it's about building worker power and organizing, obviously. But, in certain cases, you need to do more. And I think that's why, we were so excited and so proud to lead Make Amazon Pay along with our friends at Progressive International, because Amazon has so many awful impacts for so many parts of our community, for our planet, for its tax avoidance and its exploitation of workers. So when like Walton was just saying a moment ago, it's like, how do we build power with our allies in the progressive movement to make the kind of change we all need to see? Make Amazon Pay includes more than 80 unions and NGOs, of course, the ITUC, but Oxfam, Greenpeace, and many, many others. We fight on tax justice issues. We fight about Amazon's completely reckless relationship to the climate crisis, and on workers' rights. And so I think when we come together as a progressive movement with our allies, we have the opportunity to make real change, to really move the ball forward. And, I just sort of shamelessly plug, right now, join us on Black Friday. At the end of the last Friday in November, where we're going to take action. Workers will be striking, environmental groups will be challenging Amazon, and join us and go to www.makeamazonpay.com. And, this fight is for everyone. So that's, I think, how we proceed.
Thanks, Nick. So some old-fashioned union work mixed with collectivizing, ally making, coalition building, and some sophisticated research. David, you've already talked about that as a potential solution, getting the right information into the hands of policymakers. Do you have any kind of final words or other thoughts on how you're tackling this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think alongside the work that Uni and Nick are leading, which is a major key piece of this, how can we organize down the supply chain? How can we rebuild kind of old internationalist coalitions of workers and trade unions is so critical. I want to emphasize just very quickly that I think we do leave a lot on the table when it comes to the revelation of illicit activities and kind of misbehavior of these corporate actors. And just to remind us of, how quickly some of these controversies disappear. So we have these big journalists, these international consortiums of journalists that come out with these revelations of, like I said, the Pandora Papers or something, and they come into public view and they just disappear from public view. And I could enumerate a million more of these controversies of where people are caught red-handed. These corporate actors and their allies are caught red-handed in the violation of international and domestic laws. And I don't blame policymakers for failing, because that's what policymakers do. They just fail and fail time again, and all they can do is disappoint us. I think it's really our responsibility to make sure that these things don't leave public view, that we, as the representatives of forces that are at the front line of the impact from this corporate misbehavior, that we are the ones that are being really tactical and really clear-minded about the specific violations that I think we should start from these illegal violations to say this needs to be the basis for a common coordinated reaction by our allies who have real policy power at the level of multilateral organizations. We spoke a lot about the ILO, but also in the friendly governments that can make moves on this. And I think that there's too much talk about regulation as a paradigm, as opposed to simple kind of law enforcement when it comes to the criminal and illicit behavior of a lot of these reactionary actors. So I'm hopeful that putting together the investigative research piece with a more robust policy approach, I think can lead to some substantial victories in the coming years that make significant moves to dismantling this rather hidden infrastructure that I think sits behind the reactionary wave across the world.
Thanks, David. And I think you've led us to where we're going to next, which is, what is the framework for accountability for these corporations globally? And so much of what today's webinar is about is the extent to which global institutions are playing that role or not. So I'm handing over to Todd. Well, first, thank you so much to all three panelists for providing those insights and hopefully some hope. But handing over to Todd to give us more information on what does all of this have to do with the global institutions?
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Nick and Walton and David. Before I turn, just remind everybody to check the chat. You'll find links to a lot of the campaigns and some of the background, as well as the profiles on these corporate underminers, all in the chat right now. So Natalie, what we've just heard about from Nick and Walton, we've heard about these specific companies, Amazon and Glencore and Meta and Tesla, but they're not alone. They represent a much wider corporate world that protects and expands its own profits by undermining democracy. And we didn't, for example, talk about the Vanguard Group, which is the last one on our list this year. And Vanguard is one of the big four institutional investors in the world, with BlackRock, Fidelity, State Street. When David talked about the illicit financial networks, don't know where the line on what is legal and isn't is in the case of Vanguard, but what we do know is that they certainly occupy a space in that network. They provide capital to thousands of companies that do business in every industry and country in the world. They are the largest shareholder in 5 of the other companies on our list, in Amazon, in Blackstone, in Exxon, in Meta, in Tesla. And they also are major shareholders in platform companies that have shown precarity all around the world, whether it's Uber or Delivery Hero or Lyft or Gojek, familiar names depending on which part of the world you're in. And Vanguard is a company that claims to be neutral politically, but just in June of this year, they, as we mentioned in the report, they cast a pivotal shareholder vote at Tesla in favor of approving a $56 billion pay package for Elon Musk. Who we've already heard about in detail. When you give somebody when you sit on a board and claim political neutrality and then are the tie-breaking vote or one of them in giving somebody like Elon Musk money, I don't really view that as neutral. But they also use more sophisticated and shadowy instruments like donor advised funds to funnel funding. So their donors are able to use these funds to direct funding through Vanguard to far right groups that might be Islamophobic or anti-LGBTQ or for restricting the reproductive rights of women. But I think, as David pointed out too, they use these complex lobbying operations. And that's where the effect on multinational institutions, international institutions really comes into focus. That's just the stuff we can see. They are obviously present in, when Maite earlier was talking about platform work at the ILO, there's obviously an employers group. We don't know exactly all of the companies and how they're represented there, but there's an employers group working overtime right now to try to ensure we don't get a strong platform standard next year. Likewise, we see these companies led by these ultra wealthy individuals that almost invariably support and finance far-right politicians and parties. And when those parties take power, we see it in country after country after country. They discredit these global institutions, whether it's attacks on the UN or attacks on the ILO or refusal to cooperate with processes. They reduce taxes on the wealthy and on corporations, which of course they do. They undercut living wages, the very thing we've fought so hard to define, as was mentioned earlier. And they push for a return to this sort of century-old arrangement between countries where we're going to work things out bilaterally. No longer a multilateral system where we actually have to at least imperfectly try to take into account various regional and local needs, but instead one-on-one. And so that's why when we turn to our third panel now, we're going to talk about what we can do and what trade unions are doing at a global level in these global institutions to try to rein in corporate power, to try to expand democracy, either by pushing those institutions or using the processes that exist in them to rein things in. So for this panel, I'm going to introduce our last group, and we appreciate everybody for sticking with us. We'll have questions at the end of this panel. So I'm going to have Plamen Dimitrov, our colleague from Bulgaria, join us. I'm going to have Daniel Bertosa from Public Services International. I'm going to have Feni Sekiramata from ITUC affiliate CTRN in Costa Rica. And I'm going to have Mary Karimu from the Trade Union Congress of Ghana join us. And they're each going to talk about sort of a different national perspective, representing, from Bulgaria to Costa Rica to Ghana, but also specific issues that they're working on, reforms that they fought for or are fighting for that will help rein in this problem. So first, I'll hand it over to you, Plamen.
Thank you very much. Yeah, just to add a few words about my experience, just to let people know, I'm being part of the ILO Workers Group governing body during the last 10 years, and being involved in many discussions, including the platform work expert group, but also the living wage discussion and employment discussion on employment in 2022, when actually this significant breakthrough was done in an international labor conference. And this is a good example that we have to think about that. And as you said, yes, in the employers camp, in this specific case, in the platform discussion, for example, during the night, the last night, I still remember that, it was the Walmart representative sitting in the employer bench that actually blocked the final consensus and conclusions, despite of the fact that got the whole government in our side. What is my point? My point is that actually if we have enough powerful, friendly governments on our side, then even in such a situation, it can make a breakthrough and then continue, as is happening in the governing body. And as it's crucial, of course, that we have some friendly, powerful government now, in our case, including for the right to strike referral to the ICJ, but also it is very important for those two very important issues. Might have mentioned platform, standard setting, and the living wage. I'm going to speak about the living wage more focused. Of course, we know that all this far right ideologies is one of the emerging signs of the failure of the traditional democratic systems. And all we know that all these processes of having poor against poor, because it's happening at the end of the day, poor workers, national workers against the poor migrants coming in the very same country, actually showing to the old people that democracy is not delivering. And if that is the case, if someone can argue, but this is the perception. And the old and corrupted politicians are, and I have pointed out as a reason for that. And at the end of the day, our new social contract is one of the only, for me, is the only way to go further on, and of course to achieve the clear objective of full employment and decent wages as the main target for economic and social development. In the specific issue about minimum living wages, as I mentioned, there are a lot of discussions 8 years ago. There are a lot of voluntary initiatives that the multinationals refer to. But now we have tripartitely agreed both definition at an international level in the ILO governing body, but also we have a methodology. It's actually principle of methodologies, and it's important to know. And minimum living wage is also an indicator for independent workers, self-employed, and undeclared workers that help in the process of negotiation in general, since in the issue that we discussed and the conclusion of the governing body of the ILO is clearly stated. And of course, the methodology is clearly defined, and it's good help for everyone. This is the key issue, how we can transform all this issue and work done at the international level, international agenda. There are 4 areas that the baskets of prices, of goods and services using local prices should comprise on food, housing, health, and education. It is defined there, and it is good that the national circumstances are very clearly stated here, that you can act necessary goods and services based on the geographical but also national specificity. And at the end of the day, you have this definition. It's derived from the Philadelphia Declaration, of course, needs of the workers and their families. But also the issue here, which is very important, that we have normal working hours. So normal working hours definitely exclude overtime. So this was a big battle. Just to point out, it's clearly stated there. And all this basket that I'm speaking about is far away. This is beyond the mere subsistence. It's not a poverty line. It's for sure something beyond that. And every day you have this machinery here, and this should be implemented through the wage setting process according to the ILO machinery. It's mean collective bargaining, 131, Convention 131, but also collective bargaining as a key mechanisms for negotiations for statutory minimum wages and social partners' involvement, which is very explicitly mentioned here. And it's very relevant because it's make the responsibility of multinationals to dialogue with the union. It's very clear, not only the Global Union Federation, but also the local and national unions. And that's very, I think, fundamental for all this implementation at national level. And the second issue, or third issue maybe, governments and social partners should ensure the incremental progression from minimum wages to living wages. This is clearly written in the methodology, and this is an obligation. Okay, it should be, according to the national economic circumstances and development issue, but this is clear obligation, a clear goal, let's say, to go there, and a kind of prerequisite for the living wages for definition. So I also wanted to point out here one more issue about the supply chain. So I want to mention supply chain. It was a discussion how this should be linked to the supply chain. You have ILO, distant work agenda for the global supply chains. There are many initiatives, multinational, ILO multinational declaration on that, tripartitely agreed. But all these documents, in the end of the day, end up with some very complex situation at national level. And as someone mentioned, especially for those democracy, how is call it, underminers, okay, corporate power underminers, for them this is much more easy to circumvent all this machinery, even that and that. So the key issue here, that the mechanism that should be established at a national but also international level should follow how this living wage concept are implemented at national level, and how the ILO tripartitely agree machinery and methodology will replace the existing one, very commercial, let's say, invented and elaborated by different think tanks. Some of them are friendly to us, some of them not so much. Initiatives and used as a cover till now that most multinationals said, okay, we are calculating living wage with $1 or $2 above the minimum wage that you have it here in a specific country. Now this should be very transparent, and hopefully with a common efforts we will push the multinationals, all these multinationals, to play the game properly, and of course to look for the real result on this. The last point, I think that we will have a lot of machinery in ILO and the office obligation that will continue to follow how it's going to be implemented, research done, the other issue that I'm not going to go into deep now. And this is to keep accountable how the governments and the employers are implementing all this machinery. And I'm really optimistic on this now, having in mind also the OECD multinational guidelines. This also is referring to living wage. Having in mind also AU developments, both for the minimum wage directive, but also the corporate and the due diligence directive. All this machinery, all together with our campaign for democracy and for empowering, building workers' power, I'm really convinced that will make a change. Thank you. Make a difference.
Thank you very much, Plamen. You can see why, Plamen, you wear so many hats for the global trade union movement, and we're very grateful for it. So you've heard Plamen talk a lot about how we are at this point where we can actually fight for implementation, and where we need to put pressure to make sure that all of the players in the system actually move to implement this recently won definition. And I've put in the chat a link to a recent statement from ITUC when this definition was agreed. But now I want to turn to Daniel Bertosa, who's the General Secretary of Public Services International, PSI. I will put a link in the chat there. But Daniel, one of the things that you've PSI's been fighting hard for is a more equitable international tax system. So I'm going to give the floor to you to talk to us a little bit about where we are in that fight and why it's so important.
Thanks, Todd. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, look, the tax justice is an incredibly important part of the fight against corporate power. And I think David mentioned that this massive wealth that's used to lobby and create monopoly power undermines democracy. And one of the ways in which this financial power is created is through the avoidance of tax, but also it's the way in which it's funneled into jurisdictions that are not transparent and can't be held to account. So it's the secrecy aspect that is as insidious. And when you look at the big companies, and the 7 on this list are no exceptions, they pay very low tax, and some of them pay no tax in many of the places they operate. And Walton mentioned, for example, Glencore, and it's not surprising that they are based in Switzerland, as are a lot of these other companies, and they're based in Switzerland because they're tax havens. And these companies who dodge their tax responsibilities are also often the companies that dodge their responsibilities to the environment or to trade unions and labour. And that's no real surprise. I was a bit surprised when I saw the list because there's no pharmaceutical companies on the list as well. And these companies do all the things that have been mentioned. And there's also no privatized health companies either. And they have been amongst some of the largest companies in the world. The reason I mentioned this is because it was also mentioned, especially by David, but others, about the way in which the rhetoric of these companies is used to subtly undermine. And one of the things they do globally is that they avoid paying their taxes. Then they use that money to establish foundations that then promote the idea that government and the UN is bureaucratic, that it's not a business-friendly environment, that it doesn't innovate. And then they use the money that they've got from exploiting workers and dodging regulation and putting into tax havens to then fund these institutions, sometimes in the global south, but sometimes the UN system. And then they use that money to then influence the international policy making. And the Gates Foundation is really the sort of iconic example. And what's interesting there is that Bill Gates was directly involved in stopping, just as an example, Oxford University developing the COVID vaccine as a free-for-all vaccine and pushing them towards a public-private partnership with AstraZeneca. And what that did was meant that it became known as the AstraZeneca vaccine. To begin with, it was the Oxford vaccine, but when you get it now, you know it as the AstraZeneca vaccine. But also it meant that the university, who has a very pro-public rhetoric and practice, who was interested initially in providing that vaccine to everybody without charging for the intellectual property, the moment AstraZeneca was involved, at Bill Gates' personal intervention, they were in favour of not giving away the intellectual property rights. And the Gavi Vaccine Alliance, which heavily influences global health policy, is also funded by the Gates Foundation. And what we saw was that when it came to negotiating the TRIPS waiver, so that the intellectual property for the COVID vaccines could be provided more freely to all of us, in fact, that was lobbied against by some of these philanthropic foundations, but also the very large companies that they represent. So I want to make some points just about tax avoidance. To begin with, this rhetoric that's promoted that if companies in your country are forced to pay their taxes, then it's bad for workers. And what is really important is to understand that the profits actually don't stay in the countries that we're talking about. They get shifted offshore or to tax havens. And so forcing those companies to pay their taxes locally means identifying where they've shifted that that money, which is normally tax havens, bringing it back to the countries where the workers are, and that allows the tax authorities to know how much profits they've made and to tax them. But it also means that the workers who are negotiating for pay rises within those companies can get access to those profits that have been shifted to avoid tax. It also means that that tax stays in the country where the value is added, where the workers are, and that it's more likely to be invested into a productive activity or for jobs for those workers. So it is this tax avoidance issue is for multinational corporations is actually a workers issue as well. So what do we do about it? Well, first is we need more transparency. And again, David mentioned that. The OECD standards around country-by-country reporting are not great. That they've got big holes in them and exemptions that the corporate lobbyists have lobbied for. And they're also not public. The way in which we tax multinationals is also technically flawed. Again, there are lots of holes and exemptions, and most of the revenue flows to the global north. In fact, many of the countries in the global south won't get any revenue whatsoever from the OECD process. And also it channels it through the conduit countries. So a country like Switzerland has been forced to collect taxes, but what it said is they'll collect the taxes, say for Glencore, for example. It's now forced to tax Glencore's, but it said that it will just give those taxes back to Glencore as part of a grant to them. And we saw what the Irish government was saying about Apple in the last couple of weeks, where the European Union said they had to collect the tax from Apple. The Irish government opposed collecting tax from Apple, and when it was forced to collect the tax, it's now looking at ways to basically provide it back to the corporations. The other thing we need to do is we need to tax assets. Labour is disproportionately taxed because capital is often not taxed. And that's through corporate taxation, but it's also through speculative gains. So we undertax capital gains. We undertax the rise in values for property. And we need to find ways to tax excessive capital, particularly speculation. We find that, for example, amongst our members, a nurse who's working shift work to look after critically ill people might pay 30-35% tax on that labour, but corporations are paying 15% under the OECD rules, and in fact they're paying a lot less than that because there are so many loopholes. So the worker who's administering the vaccine and providing the care pays 3 times more than the multinational that's got the property rights to the vaccines they're administering. And to do that, we need a global asset register. And it's a pretty simple concept. If I've got to own a car, I register it. Houses are all registered. Even if you've got a dog in most places, you register it. And often the reason for those registrations is so you can pay tax and the government knows what your assets are. Yet yachts aren't registered. Art collections aren't registered. Gold is often not registered. Cash is not registered when they're put into tax havens. So we need to globally register these assets so that we can tax them no matter where they are. And what's important about all of this is that it requires an international architecture on tax that works. And that means at its most basic that we need a shift from tax competition and a race to the bottom. And as trade unionists, we know how that works if you don't regulate it internationally, to tax cooperation. And that coordination will mean that we can take a human rights-centered approach, not a profit extraction approach. And in fact, after the failure of the G20 and the OECD process, a range of countries demanded that we have a more inclusive and more effective global framework. And in fact, that was launched last year, and we now have discussions for a UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. And that's a very important process. We still have some corporations blocking it, and we still have some northern countries blocking it, most notably the European Union, but also Switzerland and the US, who are either outright opposing it or trying to lower the ambitions. If I can just spend the last minute or two saying what I think is required in such an international architecture to ensure that we stop this race to the bottom. The first is that it has to be inclusive. And so all countries need to be at the table on an equal basis. Labour needs to be at the table, and so does civil society, especially academics, because it can be quite a technical area. And if we don't have academics and civil society at the table, then what we'll have is lawyers, accountants, and the corporations using their expertise to block the sort of technical answers we need. It's got to be comprehensive. It must cover all corporations globally, must cover all tax havens, must cover the very wealthy. It's got to be enforceable, and we know about that in our efforts to regulate labour globally. We often get caught up on something being legally binding, but it also has to be enforceable. We know that that corporations get binding and enforceable ISDS that they can sue governments on, but we can't sue corporations. So that enforceability is really important for taxation. It's got to be transparency, and we discussed that a bit, and David's spoken about that. And importantly, it can't be dominated by corporate influence or the governments that promote their agenda. And unfortunately, at the moment, that's mainly European countries. And I just finish up by saying that often we get multi-stakeholderism promoted to us at the United Nations, and the experience in the vaccine access fights, the experience with Gavi and the Gates Foundation and in other parts of the UN, is that actually what multi-stakeholderism actually does is brings in large corporations as partners in equivalent ways to states, and it's not a way to involve labour. It's not a way to involve civil society or those countries who have weaker bargaining positions. It really is just buying into the rhetoric that enables corporations. And that sort of brings us right back to the beginning, because I mentioned the way in which Gates' involvement in the Oxford vaccine situation that's now known as AstraZeneca undermined that process. But what they do is they by not paying their taxes, they are ensuring that governments are starved of the money that's needed, and the international institutions are starved of the money that's needed. They then use that money to set up these foundations, and those foundations then donate to provide basic public services, but with conditionalities applied. And then they use that money and that influence to ensure that the UN, through this idea of multi-stakeholderism, is increasingly corporate friendly, so that, for example, they can stop the vaccine, the TRIPS waiver process, which then means that they get a lot more profits for the vaccine corporations, which then they're also usually based in Switzerland, so they dodge more taxes, and the cycle goes round and round and round. So we need to break that cycle, and I think it was mentioned right at the very beginning. The way we do that is not is through exercising national political pressure in our home countries on our governments to ensure that our governments don't avoid scrutiny when they support these in these multilateral forums and these international forums, so they don't get away with promoting. Even some very friendly governments, like the German government at the moment, has been at the forefront of undermining both the efforts to have international taxation beefed up, but also the TRIPS waiver. And we need to hold them to account for their positions on the international stage. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Danny, and a lot to think about there. To answer your question about pharmaceutical and health companies, we have a very long list that we're working on, and we'd be happy to work with PSI to understand a little bit better who and why and where. Unfortunately, I think as we mentioned earlier, when you start putting the microscope, you realize that not only are the 7 not the only ones, but we might be dealing with a corporate world that's where the issues we're pointing out are the norm instead of the exception. So the list can be very long, but we really appreciate the intervention on tax. And I think that we'll hear a little bit more about this and other issues from our next speaker, who is Fanny Sequeira, who is the Secretary General of CTRN in Costa Rica. And she's going to be talking to us about transnational corporations and how trade unions in the region are fighting to advance democracy and workers' rights. And then after that, we'll hear from Mary from TUC before we turn to questions. So Fanny, the floor is yours.
Gracias, Todd. En relación con las empresas transnacionales, la democracia y los derechos de los trabajadores y trabajadoras, la Confederación Sindical de Trabajadores y Trabajadoras de las Américas, CSA, puntualiza que las empresas transnacionales están en busca de mercados de producción más competitivos, que les ofrezcan menores costos de insumos, procesos y fuerza de trabajo barata, a la vez que puedan aumentar los consumidores potenciales de sus productos y servicios. Se instalan donde encuentran ventajas comparativas, posibilidades de beneficios fiscales, como se ha dicho, bajos costos de producción, salarios reducidos y la minimización de las condiciones de trabajo y de vida dignas, recurriendo a nuevas formas de organización del trabajo y la producción, como la subcontratación o la tercerización, orientando e influyendo las cadenas globales de producción y de suministros de acuerdo con sus intereses y negocios. En las cadenas globales de producción se fragmenta, diluye y esconde la responsabilidad patronal por el bienestar y el respeto a los derechos de las trabajadoras y los trabajadores, profundizando la precarización, atentando contra la igualdad y la equidad de género en situaciones de violencia, fomentando el uso intensivo del trabajo en condiciones de informalidad o no registrada, así como nuevas formas de esclavitud moderna, sin salud y seguridad laboral, sin protección social e incluso vinculando el trabajo infantil y sus peores formas, entre otros. Las democracias están siendo atacadas y capturadas por los intereses de las empresas transnacionales, en alianza con élites políticas, oligarquías nacionales y medios de comunicación concentrados y concentradores. Todo esto en paralelo con una flexibilización y desregulación de las normas laborales y el derecho del trabajo, en particular del derecho colectivo. Producto de las profundas desigualdades imperantes, se han agudizado los conflictos y la polarización social. Las agendas comerciales, financieras y de inversiones están reproduciendo compromisos que sirven a los intereses de las empresas transnacionales, dejando de lado la perspectiva del trabajo decente y del desarrollo humano. Desde la CCA y sus organizaciones afiliadas, trabajamos por una perspectiva de desarrollo integral, contrahegemónica y realmente sustentable. El desarrollo como concepto y programa de los pueblos se funda en los principios de la justicia social, económica y ambiental, la igualdad y equidad de género, la democracia y los derechos humanos plasmados en la Plataforma de Desarrollo de las Américas, PLADA. Junto con la CCI, luchamos por un nuevo contrato social. Ante las limitaciones que presentan todos los instrumentos voluntarios creados hasta ahora, consideramos necesario avanzar hacia la formulación de propuestas más ambiciosas y justas para regular la relación entre empresas y derechos humanos, como el tratado vinculante que se negocia actualmente. En América Latina y el Caribe tenemos oportunidad de avanzar en la recuperación democrática y de agendas sociopolíticas que respondan al interés de los pueblos. Esto es, los foros internacionales y las instituciones internacionales, para lo cual consideramos fundamental dialogar con los gobiernos para que tengan un papel activo en las negociaciones, actuar para articular posiciones, contribuir con la formulación desde los gobiernos y avanzar en los contenidos que formula el movimiento sindical y la sociedad civil. Trabajamos con la Jornada Continental de los Pueblos en este sentido. Frente a la alianza público-corporativa, es preciso transitar firmemente hacia una alianza antagónica y alternativa de carácter público comunitaria. Solo esta, partiendo de una profunda redefinición del bien común, permitirá blindar espacios estratégicos ante la deriva de la mercantilización capitalista, ensanchando el marco para el desarrollo de sistemas políticos y económicos relocalizados, democráticos, ecológicos y justos, en los que las personas se sitúen en el centro de las políticas. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Fanny, for your contributions. It's critical for us at ITUC when we have these discussions to make sure that we see the perspective of workers, as you've seen today, from multiple sectors, from the public sector and the private sector, and from multiple regions, whether that's the Americas or Africa or the Asia Pacific, Europe, because it is a common struggle. One of the reasons we picked the corporate underminers that we did is that these are companies that are pervasive. There's very few places in the world where the Blackstone Group doesn't have within their portfolio a building in your city, even a home that one of your members might live in, or amongst the assets it holds or that it manages, a company that's abusing workers in your country. And that's why we need, as Fanny was saying, binding instruments, something that we can actually hold people to accountable instead of these voluntary, I think as Danny put it, sort of public relations driven frameworks. And that's what we're going to have Mary talk to us a little bit about from TUC Ghana, which is a binding treaty on transnational corporations and human rights. Thank you for joining us, Mary. You're the last on our final panel, but we really appreciate your contributions, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Todd, for the introduction. I'm speaking on the topic, winning a binding treaty on business and human rights. And I would like to start by reiterating the ITUC's for democracy campaign point that says that democracy cannot be considered a reality at work or in our society or in global institutions, whilst corporations can abuse trade unions and human rights without liability. Now, winning a binding treaty on business and human rights requires strategic actions. We know that the ITUC and Global Union Federations have been in the forefront since 2016, negotiating with intergovernmental working groups at the UN Human Rights Council. But this has not come without challenges. For me, as we journey on, it's important we bear in mind the need for a collective effort at advocating for a binding treaty on business and human rights to address the imbalance of power between corporation and workers. And our effort must be rooted in the desire to hold multinational companies accountable for human rights violations, particularly in their supply chains. Now, some may argue that we have voluntary initiatives such as the guideline, the UN Guiding Principle on Human Rights. We also have the ILO Tripartite Declaration for Principles on Multinational Enterprises and Social Policy, that's in short the MNE Declaration, which offers guidelines to multinational enterprises, government and employers and workers' organizations. And here in Ghana, for instance, the ILO is supporting the social partners on the realization of the MNE Declaration. We are also in the process of developing a national action plan on business and human rights to bring the business environment at par with international best practices in corporate responsibility on human rights. Now, this instrument, as well as other instruments mentioned by previous speakers, particularly Evelyn Oxtor, are very important that as trade unions we align ourselves with. But my point is that these instruments are non-binding, hence the need for a legally enforceable treatment that will require businesses to comply with human rights standards and offer remedies when violations occur, particularly in sectors with vulnerable labor force, including the care economy, the platform economy, the migrant workers, among others. And so therefore, as unions, we must channel our efforts at leveraging international union networks by participating in their global campaigns to hold corporations accountable for labor violation. I would also urge that as unions, we engage our respective governments, especially ahead of the 10th session of the UN Open-Ended Intergovernmental Working Group on Transnational Corporations and other business enterprises with respect to human rights to discuss the binding treaty. It's very important that we get our governments to engage in this process. The meeting is coming up somewhere in December instead of October. There is the need for continuous, especially at the national level, that we continuously do education and training for our union members and workers about business and human rights issues in order to empower them for the treaty and to take part in negotiations and campaigns. And here I would like to say that in Africa, we have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is to create a single continental market trade for goods and services. But these agreements, as they stand now, do not include social and labor rights. And therefore, we need to push for this treaty in a much higher voice. We, of course, must continue to raise the public awareness and education and mobilize workers, community, and consumers about the need for this treaty. Make our voices heard louder and clear. I will end my intervention by emphasizing that the fight for a binding treaty on business and human rights as a global architecture to reshape the relationship between businesses, workers, and society. Of course, no matter the size or location of the business, I mean, such a treaty must be enforced. Our role as unions is crucial because we represent the voices of workers, the very people whose rights are often affected by irresponsible business practices. Examples we've heard from previous speakers. We know firsthand the impact of unchecked corporate power, and we understand the need for strong enforceable regulations that go beyond voluntary codes or guidelines, as I've mentioned earlier. And therefore, winning this treaty will require solidarity, coordination, and persistent advocacy. I end here and I thank you for your intervention as I wait for questions, if any. Thank you very much, Todd. Over.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that. We really appreciate your contribution. What we've heard over the last few minutes from the last panel here is a series of solutions, and they can seem very high level. Some are very, or you can take very practical action. As Mary was speaking, I dropped in the chat a petition that ITUC has launched today to demand that your government support a binding treaty and the process that's underway. Those negotiations were slated to begin next month, but I think have been moved to December. But that petition, that gives us even more time to collect signatures. I think since the beginning of the call till now, we've got about 600. So keep sending and keep signing. But now we want to turn to you, those of you who for almost 2 hours have been patiently waiting and listening. We have about 10 minutes, maybe a little more, to field questions. So if you have questions, I would ask you to raise your digital hand like I am doing here. And we also have some in the chat we can address, but you should be able to raise your digital hand like this, and I will call on you. We'll take you off of mute, and we'll let you directly ask your question to the panelist. If you have a panelist that you're specifically looking to hear from, please name them. If it's general, please say this is for everybody. So I see the first one here from Nicoletta. Nicoletta, I'm going to allow you to talk now. So you should come off of mute and identify who you're with, if you're with a union or organization, and then please pose your question.
I'm sorry, I didn't raise my hand, but anyway, I mean, maybe I just pushed the wrong button. Anyway, I just wanted to put in the chat and introduce the Anti-Fascist International Network. That it's what we are working, and we are working quite hard in the last month. We have a webinar. I'm going to put it in the chat and to encourage all the unions that have not joined us yet to join us, because the work we are doing is very important, and we think that the more we are, the best we can do, and we want to involve a lot of unions. And the issue that you have proposed today is very interesting. Maybe we are going to deepen it and to ask you for your help. Thank you very much. Sorry, I didn't raise my hand.
No worries. Nicoletta, I'm never going to be upset when somebody uses a trade union call to do a little bit of organizing for their group. The International Anti-Fascist Union Network is in part hosted by our comrades at CIGIL, and has been one that we have spoken to at ITUC specifically about the role of the far right in some of this work that we're doing. So unless I see other hands, I'm going to turn to a couple of them that are in the chat. Katerina has opened and said, building from what Walton's point on Tesla's role in a so-called greener economy and setting precedent, et cetera, it would be interesting to hear from others if there are similar examples in other sectors in which a company is key in the transition and it could damage rights in the sector. So that's the verbatim. Does anybody want to take that on? Somebody who sees an analog or a parallel to Tesla's role in the in setting precedents in the green economy? Do we see a company in another sector that plays a similar role that maybe we should be on the lookout for? Any of the panelists want to take this one? Yeah, Danny.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned a couple in the health sector. You're seeing large pharmaceutical companies doing exactly the same when they create norms and influence debates around the role of governments in the provision of healthcare. We also see the same for privatized healthcare. We see very, very large privatized healthcare companies promoting the idea that government is inefficient, government's not innovative, but at the same time starving governments of revenue, with the idea being that if you privatize those companies, or privatize those services, then the private sector will be more efficient. And in fact, what we know is that when that happens, then the privatized service providers extract the wealth, take government subsidies. We've seen that in care, for example. We've seen massive amounts of extraction, largely through property speculation in long-term care homes. And in France, just a few weeks ago, in fact, last week, I think, we had another report that showed in childcare, that privatized childcare was actually really just about these large corporations creating a narrative about state inefficiency, getting privatized care, and then extracting taxpayers' money into private dividends, but also channeling that into tax havens. So I think there are a range of areas where this happens, but at the moment, one of the really big ones that you will all be aware of and your members will be aware of is health privatization, pharmaceuticals, and the care economy.
That's perfect. Thank you very much, Danny. We have a couple of other questions in the chat, but I do see a live question now. I'm going to turn to Rashim Bedi. Rashim, I'm going to allow you to talk. Please, if you're associated with an organization, please identify, and also please direct your question to a specific panelist if it is meant for a specific panelist. Rashim, are you there? If not, we will move to the Q&A again. Okay. One question we have from a member of a progressive political party in the Dominican Republic who has joined our call is wondering how political parties can get involved in the global movement for fair taxes. Maybe I'll go to Danny again on that one, or Evelyn, whoever would like to. Evelyn, why don't you take that one? Thanks.
I'm sure that Danny would wish to add on, but just to signal that it's very important for political parties to, whether you're, let's say, in opposition or whether you are part of a government, to signal to your government the importance of supporting a UN convention around tax, and in particular supporting provisions around progressive taxation, in line with all of the, let's say, the demands that Danny mentioned around fair corporate taxation. It's really critical that governments are aware of your position. I would say that when the terms of reference for the UN Convention on Tax was adopted earlier this summer, there were a number of notable governments that were in opposition or who abstained, which is really unfortunate. Even in governments with so-called labor-friendly governments like the US. And so it's quite critical, I think, that we work together to build momentum. Danny knows very well within the Trade Union Network for Tax Justice, a number of common demands from trade unions that have been articulated, which, if there are political parties who are interested, I think a lot of this is publicly shareable. But we need to gather momentum now, as this process is now ongoing for the next 2 years.
Thanks.
But maybe, Danny, you want to add on to that?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that's a great introduction, Evelyn. Thanks. I think there's a major problem with the coordination of political parties on progressive issues that require international responses. I think it's much broader than tax. It goes to climate, it goes to labor rights, if we're going to regulate globally, because we need to control capital is global, we know that. And we are the first internationalists, like socialists have been internationalists for longer than anyone else, but we're not very good at coordinating ourselves across national borders, because ultimately the regulatory frameworks there's not an international parliament. There's just a series of national governments that come together. And so the first thing is to say everyone's got to do their bit nationally, but we've got to coordinate that better. And I don't think we do a very good job of that, particularly amongst political parties. And I think actually David Adler might have something interesting to say about that, because I think he operates in that space. Specifically on tax, we've been looking at ways to do that. And I will put a link into the chat for ICRIT, which is an international commission on the reform of corporate taxation that PSI has been, we chair actually the management board, but the global labour movement has supported strongly over the last 5 or 6 years, precisely for that purpose. I think Leo's just popped it in the chat. So have a look at that, and if you're a political party and you want to get engaged and you want to know from credible international experts what a progressive, pro-worker, pro-development, pro-global South tax regime looks like, then ICRIT is as good as you'll get, and you can rest assured that Labor is on the inside of that.
Thank you, Danny. Plamen, I see you have your hand, and then we have one more question we'll take before I turn to Jordania to close the call. Plamen, and then the question.
Thank you. I just wanted to add, not to repeat what Danny have said, that the progressive political parties, especially in my region, in Eastern Europe, are not necessarily well organized and coordinated. On top of that, some of that being involved during the years in a wrong policy, implementing the flat income tax, as in my country, but also in most of the Eastern European countries. So this experience are really bad, and the other part of the region should learn from that. I mean, not to repeat it, of course. And the second thing that I wanted to say, somehow today we didn't touch the social protection system. Okay, it's not the taxes, but universal social protection is really very important, and it also needs policy debates with the progressive parties, and of course actions to introduce and implement the right social security contribution measures, and of course the policy and the end of the system. Thank you.
Thank you, Plamen, and thank you for bringing in social protection again. We had a question here from, I think it was just answered by Danny, but I'll pose it to the group because I think we could combine it with another, which is Sister Rashim, who tried to speak earlier but couldn't be heard, from SEWA, which is the Self-Employed Women's Association based in India. Wanted to comment on the living wage aspect pointed out by Walton. I think she said Walton here. As an informal sector national union, the minimum wage is next to impossible, as the workers are not able to prove employee-employer relationship. Nevertheless, they support it and also say that minimum wage should be set at national levels. So I'd both, Plamen, and you just spoke on this issue, so I'd be curious to hear there. And an earlier question, sort of what role for people who may be unemployed in the movement and in these actions. So we have informal workers on the one hand who have no formal employment relationship, and we have people that might be unemployed, which I come from the US system, is a very fine line often, because people may be considered unemployed who work certain gig jobs and are not actually employees. So I'd be very curious, Plamen, on living wages, the fight for living wages and informal sector. You're still on mute.
I'm saying that this is a big challenge. I can admit that, but at this stage, you have in our definition, but also methodology, as I said, if you remember, that the only independent workers, self-employed, including undeclared workers, being covered from this definition. Of course, at national level, it's much more difficult to do this. I know my personal experience for that, but that for this moment, it's good to know it's not only for hired labor, it's not only for the employee, but for all workers, and it's agreed. And then, of course, we have to have enough time to go in deep how to implement it. This is not easy to explain in 1 minute. But I think that they are some. I'm really serious. There are some tools that actually allow us to go further on. Evelyn knows something about that, but maybe if you add something, that would be helpful. Not to speak too much. Thank you.
Thanks, Flamen. Yeah, Evelyn, and then I'll turn to Jordania to close the call.
I'll be really brief, but just to add on to what Plamen had said, first of all, in terms of the ILO definition, the living wage is an estimation on the cost of living for workers and their families. Now, it can be implemented in different ways. The main vehicles of doing so are through minimum living wages as well as collective bargaining, though that came through very clearly within the expert group definition. But the living wage is a reference point based on workers' needs that you can use in all kinds of negotiations, whether it be nationally, whether it be sectorally, whether it be company specific. Another just really important point to mention with regards to informal economy and minimum wages is that legally speaking, in general, minimum wages apply to those workers who are registered and are in formal employment. Nevertheless, we know from the evidence that the minimum wage is a really important reference point for collective bargaining and also has been shown to affect wages of workers in the informal economy as well. So whether or not informal workers can benefit from a statutory minimum, they are nevertheless able to benefit when a minimum wage increases, that reference point increases. That's all.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'm going to hand it to our Deputy General Secretary, Jordania, who opened the call to help bring it all together at the end and close it out for us. But thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to the Business and Human Rights Resource Center for moderating our second panel. And I'll hand it over to Jordania now.
Muchísimas gracias, Todd. Muchísimas gracias a todas y todos nuestros panelistas por los puntos de vista, los intercambios, las ideas y sobre todo el trabajo que están haciendo en favor de la democracia y por todas estas situaciones que se han planteado en este panel. De verdad que tenemos un desafío interesante, pero también hay una voluntad política bastante fuerte para asumirlo e enfrentarlo, que sabemos que entre todos y todas vamos a poder hacerlo. Bien, escuchamos en un momento también el tema de la campaña a favor de un tratado vinculante sobre las empresas y los derechos humanos. Y la CCI hoy lanza una petición para que se pueda ayudar a exigir al gobierno a que apoye este esfuerzo crítico. Esta petición ahora mismo me parece que ya la han enviado nuestros compañeros o compañeras en el chat y pedimos que por favor se firme, que por favor la compartan con los miembros de las organizaciones, con las redes personales, con las redes políticas y que por favor se difunda en las diferentes redes sociales de inmediato. Hay muchas posibilidades de que nuestros sindicatos, nuestros movimientos sociales se estén organizando a los trabajadores y a las trabajadoras para luchar y que se puedan regular estas empresas socavadoras de la democracia que hemos nombrado hoy, que a mí me parece importante resaltar que hay que ponerle nombre a las cosas y esa es parte de la tarea y por eso felicito muchísimo a nuestro equipo, a Todd, a Philip y todo nuestro equipo de organización y comunicación que ha hecho un esfuerzo bastante grande en el marco de nuestra campaña por la democracia y en este momento que se ha colocado esta lista porque sabemos que esto pasa, sabemos que es una realidad, pero también la gente tiene que conocer quiénes son estas empresas y que como Todd en un momento decía, no son solamente estas 7, hay más. Pero quisimos visibilizar por el momento estas que sabemos que están generando un gran impacto en nuestra gente y en el respeto, ¿no?, a los derechos sindicales y a los derechos humanos. Estas empresas socavadoras de la democracia que hemos nombrado hoy, pues la podemos encontrar también en nuestras redes, en nuestros espacios y bueno, podemos seguir compartiendo estos enlaces que también están en el chat para que se utilicen como herramientas para las campañas que vamos a seguir haciendo en torno a la democracia. La CCI va a seguir en campaña por la democracia. Estamos comenzando de alguna manera a enfatizar cada vez más esta campaña y por eso hacemos el llamado a que se firme esta petición. Puedes unirte a esta lista participando o también puedes visitar a nuestras páginas, la www.ituc-medios-cci.org for Democracy para encontrar las acciones en los diferentes países. Muchísimas gracias, compañeros y compañeras, al panel, a quienes participaron desde fuera, a quienes hicieron las preguntas, a nuestros compañeros y compañeras de la traducción y solamente decirles que cuando nos unimos para luchar de manera conjunta, de manera colectiva, pues las victorias también son colectivas. Y yo creo que el movimiento sindical esto lo tiene muy, muy claro. Así que si luchamos juntos y juntas, obviamente vamos a ganar juntos y juntas. Fuerte abrazo, muchísimas gracias compañeros, compañeras. Seguimos en lucha. ¿Todd? ¿Tenías algo más, Todd? ¿No? Un abrazo fuerte, compañeros y compañeras.